Hello there! So today we are going to talk about biotic and abiotic factors. Ecosystems are made up of two larger components, one being non-living components and the other being the living components. So when something is a living component of the ecosystem, we call it a biotic factor, and when it's part of the non-living component, we call it an abiotic factor. So examples of abiotic factors are water, air, nutrients, solar energy, things of that nature, while biotic factors consist of the producers, consumers, and decomposers of the ecosystem. So all of the living organisms in a creek are the biotic factors of that area. So, for example, there are parasites such as leeches, there's pathogenic and non-pathogenic kinds of bacteria. We specifically looked at E. coli, which in itself is usually not pathogenic. However, it's an indicator species to more dangerous kinds of bacteria. So if conditions are favorable for E. coli to grow, then they're also favorable for more dangerous types of bacteria to grow. So we measured that. There are different predators that live there. Like we said, carnivores are part of the biotic factors of a creek. And so the raccoons, they're crayfish, there's a lot of stuff down there. Being predator and prey. So we're going to focus a little bit more on the abiotic factors of a creek. Those are the non-living chemical factors of the area. So we're going to talk about things like light intensity, soil and rock type, which actually is going to be covered by Justin. We're going to talk about the pH level of the water, what that means, the dissolved oxygen levels in the water, the levels of phosphorus that are there, in the form of phosphates and orthophosphates, and the level of nitrogen that is there in the forms of nitrates and nitrites. Most importantly, we're going to figure out how all those factors affect the creek ecosystem. The light intensity of the creek refers to how much sun is going to get through the water and how much that is going to go all the way to the bottom. Light intensity affects plant growth in the area, algae growth, and the ability of certain microorganisms to survive. So this makes sense. We have the creek, which is generally pretty shallow. There are some deeper parts, but the water isn't too turbid, so the light still penetrates all the way through. Gets down to the bottom, and so there's a good opportunity for plants and algae and things like that to get the sun they need to grow. An example of this not happening would be in the ocean, where the water spout in some places gets so deep that sun doesn't go all the way through, and those organisms need to learn to survive in the complete dark without sunlight. That's not where I'd want to be. So, quick chemistry lesson. Water contains both hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions. So, the relative concentrations of these determine whether a solution is acidic or basic, and we measure this in pH, so the power of hydrogen. More hydrogen ions make the water acidic, and more hydroxide ions make the water basic. Algae blooms will raise pH, while higher temperatures and runoff will lower pH. Now, the lower a pH is, the more soluble things are in the water, which is kind of dangerous because the water can become more toxic when copper and aluminum, heavy metals like that, dissolve into the water that aquatic organisms are trying to live in. Another abiotic factor that we measure in water is the amount of dissolved oxygen gas that's in it. Oxygen just dissolves into the water directly from the atmosphere. So when we have a low dissolved oxygen level, that usually indicates water pollution. And when you add low oxygen levels to polluted water, that doesn't really bode well for the life that lives there. Two more abiotic factors are the levels of both phosphorus and nitrogen in an ecosystem. Both of these nutrients occur naturally and on their own generally would not be considered a pollutant. However, having an excess of these nutrients is bad for the creek ecosystem. Excess sources of phosphorus can be sediments from soil erosion, runoff from agricultural fields and treatment lagoons. Excess nitrogen tends to come from a lot of the same sources, and it also includes things like sewers. Thankfully, even though we have farms and things upstream of Rocky Fork Creek, our tests indicated that nitrogen and phosphorus levels are in a safe range. So we ran all these tests on our creek, Rocky Fork, and based on the results we got back, there was a chart that said if you got I don't know, X concentration of this nutrient, then that corresponds to this score. After we got all the scores for all the different abiotic factors that we tested, we weighted them on a scale, and when you added all of those values together, we got an overall Q value, what it's called. It's just a ranking of the health of the creek and its abiotic factors. So our Q value said that our creek was in very, very good condition, which is good to hear.